Welcome to Portals of Perception and to Jeff and Aviv skating to the edge and beyond. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Aviv. There's not much ice where I am today in Mexico, but we can still skate on the proverbial thin ice, and I very much look forward to it.
Indeed, and I'm in Jupiter, Florida, so we are both enjoying a nice weather. We are recording this in December of 23. The last time we spoke was September, just 3 months ago. And that's when we generated both the ghost and the inner conclave conversation, and then went deep into the teacher and student double trap and the potential unlock of that. So a lot has happened in the world since, and a lot has happened on the frontiers that we are pioneering. And I'm ready to do a deep dive today into a body of work we developed over the weekend, where we further activated some of the voices and the characters inside the inner conclave, and really worked with some promotions and inquiries that came our way, and explored again with the Epoch Network community how to use the inner conclave as a way of birthing the new human that's arising now, the Solaris human and the Universalis human. So that's what I have in mind to share. You were going to, right after we spoke last, to go on a Himalayan pilgrimage. So is there anything from that or anything else you feel ready to share?
Well, there would be a lot to say about the pilgrimage. What comes to me is, first of all, an appreciation of pilgrimage as a way of deepening in life. And so in this instance, I journeyed with a couple of friends to a few of the very sacred places in the Himalayas. And they include Kedarnath, Badrinath, a village that is close to the border with Tibet, and also some sacred caves. And it's really helpful to have the embodied experience of going into the cave. I have done that metaphorically and in certain ways by taking time out and not scheduling, and to literally go into the cave and sit in the darkness and the kind of consistent cool of a space where holy people, celebrated holy people have been over the centuries and millennia is humbling and very inspiring. So I emerged from this pilgrimage with greater clarity about the work, the nature of the work, the path, the process, and hopefully the fruition.
If you need to try to characterize a nature or a quality or a dimension that you feel has joined you and been with you since, what would you say? What would you describe?
There's been a honing and an amplification of the transmission. So sitting in the back of the cave, there was a kind of absorption that I can then convey outward. So it's like a transmission from the cave comes through this body, mind, and this work that was perhaps not present before or not present to the same degree. And I'm still discovering what this means.
Well, I sense what you're describing both as finding a deeper locations, like sitting deeper in yourself, number one, and number two, another dimension. Perhaps archetypal, perhaps another word is needed there, joining you in the embodiment of your journey. So this sounds beautiful.
Now, you mentioned Homo Solaris, and we've talked about Homo Universalis, and I've recently heard the term Homo Sanctus, And so I add that into the mix, and somehow that feels relevant. Going to holy places to receive and celebrate the divinity of the human.
It is an opportune context because what we're about to go into is the Inner Conclave work, which one could describe as the inner cave. Also, in terms of the place inside us where we can do the inner work, and as we described before, a place to expand the inner space rather than contract the inner space. So what I want to do is I want to bring some slides, and I want first to take just a couple of minutes to ground us in the story we developed in September in our first exploration into this body of work that in some ways have been in private cultivation for 30 years, as I will delineate today, because I'm going to offer a bit of the backstory, the origin story of how that evolved and developed for me. And then we will unfold a more practical, because there were questions, so what practical advice would you offer for anybody trying to embark on this journey? So indeed today it's about exploring the inner conclave, and by way of looking to cultivate 3 octaves of work. We will come back in the future and we'll tell the story in other ways, but today it's about those 3 octaves. And when we narrated the story, first time we explored this, we offered the perspective of the journey of the soul and how it was that we each, when we show up for this life, we show up with an operating system that we call the soul that helps us negotiate and mediate and navigate the planetary experience while we are the embodiment of a spirit, a universal spirit in the planetary body, and that the soul is a carriage of 2, in the simplest way, 2 dimensions. It is there to keep you alive, and it is there to facilitate you to unlock your highest expression. And we suggested each person shows up here with a unique set of qualities and perhaps a primary nature that can be discovered. And the suggestion, the context was that whilst that is the as was meant to be natural line of development, what often happens very early in life and sometime a little later is that one is experiencing either a separating event as a sequence of small t trauma experiences or a larger trauma event, and that initiates a core anguish and instigates what we described as a ghost pattern. The ghost pattern is emerging in the sense of the desire of the soul to reclaim its original brief, even when it is separated. And we described how the second pain, the second shadow, which we are in this work rewriting as a ghost, is the pattern that emerges in the fixation and the fascination of that quality that a life was separated from, where often then what emerges is a behavior that compensates, that the psychology of the soul is to compensate for what is lost by something that endeavors to emulate the absence of that quality. And we then described how there are a range of energetic and psychospiritual and psychological byproducts, the sense of anxious preoccupation, loss of aliveness and presence, the loss of resilience and the willpower and the capacity to be defiant, shrinkage of mind, and many other dimensions. And we then introduced an idea for a soul inquiry where one begins to explore a way of looking at the experience of a life, not as a subject, but as an object, where my experience, as personal and as dramatic or melodramatic as it may be, can become a laboratory of work and discovery. So that's the reversal of the subject to object, and we delineated the kind of inquiry that will accompany that to seek to discover what is it we're defending from, what is it we're yearning for, and what are we discovering about that or through that in terms of the idealized quality or nature that the soul yearns for, and what might be some of the, this is where we, again, the historic context, we talked about it as shadow work, what might we choose to integrate that has been disowned, and we offered here that there was a way to, almost like in the metaphor of the horse whisperer, who is whispering in the horse's ear, by recreating the experience, that's one way to release the anguish, which, as we know, is one of the ways they treat post-traumatic disorder, Jeff, when they take people in the armed forces to create gentle exposure to the environment, but to then allow them to reintegrate what has been the catalyst point of the traumatic experience. In other words, convert an arresting, freezing trauma experience that is lodged as a post-traumatic disorder to facilitate post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic development, post-traumatic liberation, because the literature often forgets to point that there is that tremendous opportunity. And that is part of the potential. When we do this work, we may be able to unlock the antidote to disarm the contraction and to relax into releasing an outdated story and embrace and liberate that original configuration, which is one way to think about first a healing process and then a development and cultivation process. And these are the first two octaves we are about to further explore in the Inner Conclave. So that led to the Inner Conclave as a space that one can expand rather than contract. And we went step by step through to build the various voices and natures that we could reintegrate and we could birth and we could explore and discover in the Inner Conclave. And that was the journey we completed. So I think, yeah, that's what we got to then. Let me pause here and see if anything comes alive for you to comment about just catching up with the story.
Well, I greatly appreciate the refresher, since last time we spoke about the Inner Conclave was pre-pilgrimage, and that truly feels like another lifetime and another historical era. So I'm coming today with a kind of fresh perspective and soaking it in as best I can. I love how systematic it is. There's this picture of turning over every stone and making sure there are no ghosts lurking that haven't been acknowledged.
Indeed. So we approached the work this weekend first by grounding in the origin story of how the modality developed in the first place. And I want to recapture that and then walk through the practices that we develop. So we explored the backstory of the Inner Conclave discovery. And this, Jeff, goes back to 1983. So 40 years ago. I was 24, to reveal my age. And I got to hear a great spiritual teacher sharing a story that contained the following phrase, where he said, when I was a young boy, I decided to talk to myself. And as I started to talk to myself, I decided to make it important so that I would pay attention. And everything in me got mesmerized at that point. And as I reflected through the years what was so mesmerizing about the message, I discovered and realized it was twofold. First, there was a sense of here was a young life that became so present to a sense of purpose so earlier on, even as a child. And secondly, there was the message and the invitation and the transmission that you could really choose to create and to author your own portrait. And you could self-direct to become what you decided to think about, talk about, focus on. And so in some ways, my discovery some 10 years later, 10, 12 years later, that I could talk to myself in multiple voices rather than just in one, and not be sent to the psychiatric ward, but rather psychiatric ward, but rather use that as a healing modality, can be traced to that moment. And then several years after that, I was exposed to this idea that there was a way for you to, in this life, journey into the multiplicity of lives you will then birth in the universe. And it looked very far out of reach and mystical, but the logistical reasoning of how the universe works in terms of when we get to cultivate a nature or a presence or an essence or source, any emanatory quality or any quality, as we metabolize and process these dimensions, they leave the residual content in our formation. And there is the law that says that everything returns to the source of its arising, and that works by it tracking its signature and destination and its resonance by the law of sympathetic resonance and tuning fork, if you like, somewhat like the salmon fish is able to swim back to its point of origin. So the logistics and the understanding of the mechanics of that was understood, but it looked very, very far out of reach. Still, what it pointed to was the rich kind of a development work one could do here in this planetary domain, where, for example, if you choose to cultivate different roles, so you may be a partner, you may be a parent, you may be a gardener, you may be a healer, you may be a teacher, you may be acting in different capacities and roles. When you choose to develop each of those independent of the other, and you cultivate and ground each of those capacities inside some quality and nature that has a permanent custodial property or quality to it, then it lives beyond you. So a simple way to appreciate it is that the words of Khalil Gibran, the words of Mary Oliver, they continue to live in the many people that enjoy the beautiful poetry And at the same time, the proposal is that there is even something beyond that in what it was that they created and generated, because we understand that energy cannot be eliminated, cannot be dispersed, it can change form. So there may be a way for energetic forms to find their continuance. So there was that understanding, and that kind of unlocked and invited a major catalyst to this work. And then I've experienced in my 44 years of conscious journey by now, I hope I don't need to experience another one, but if I do, that's all right. I've experienced 5 tours in the desert. Some people talk about it as the dark night of the soul. I never experienced it quite like a dark night in the soul, but I experienced times where I felt like I've reached the end of the road and there was no clear path forward, and I was desperate, I was confused, I was unsure. Often it had a practical life circumstance that confronted me and certainly challenged the idea of living into the journey of purpose and development. And one of those deserts occurred when we came to the US, my family and I, in '93, because I've always been involved with a variety of communities, and all of a sudden I found myself without people to talk to, without being in a community, without having any functional role in the community, and all I had was myself. I had to talk to myself. So the birthing of the Inner Conclave is occurring at that time in '93, '94, when I become my own community, and I have to find the community within, the conclave within, the orchestra within, and I'm beginning to birth the modality, and then it leads to also series of writings where I write the passion play of these different voices and different actors inside the conclave. And journeying and bringing us all the way to the current time, this leads to what I have described as integrating the human assembly quest, the capacity, the journey of assembling the different elements that you want to cultivate in your character, which in an adjacent way we described in the conversation we called the 1,000 Faces of Homo Universalis, where I will forever be appreciative and grateful that when you saw this, well, I'll show it later, the slide of the 1,000 Faces, it will, you said, well, it sounds to me like you have more that you need to do here in terms of potential. So it was that gave birth to the Inner Conclave discovery. So let me pause here, just give you a chance to comment to the backstory.
I appreciate the history of how it emerged, and that helps me to see my own version of the emergence of an inner conversation. And there were points along the way when I had the aha or eureka of engaging with the self in a deeper way, and actually, in some sense, reprogramming myself in my responses to the world. And I guess I'll give one specific example, just since I threw that out there. I noticed in 2008 that I was having a recurring thought, and it came back a few times. And I said right then and there, from this point forward, if I have a thought more than twice, I will stop. And for the most part, that has continued to be the case. So I was, in the conversation with myself and instructing myself, and I see, the inner teacher showing up here, teacher guide 1, 2, and 3. I see and am drawn to actually Deity 1 and Deity 2, and would like to hear more about those.
Beautiful. I'll make 3 comments on what you offered. Number one, that's the beauty of the work. There are as many inner conclaves as there are people by potential. You could say that the majority of humanity would often not be in a situation to cultivate that space, and many people unfortunately only find that they have 2 voices in their conclave. Their conclave is truncated to, I feel quite all right today, or I'm agitated and frustrated today. So it becomes a polarity. The promise is that we are unlocking something that will invite each person to their own discovery in a whole new way, and their conclave will have unique voices and unique natures. So that's number one. Number two, the specific example you offered where you have made this interior self-engineering and rewiring of disarming. So this is exactly what we are proposing in the potential of doing the inner work, both at the level of healing and the level of development. And is you demonstrating an example of releasing a ghost, because one of the characterizations we described about the ghost is it will show up as a script that replays in the monkey mind and reintroduce itself. The third brief comment is you mentioned 2008. 2008 is an important window to some other time retraced to. Not only was it the subprime financial crisis, it was an archetypal breakdown where the changeover of the epoch was accelerating, and it was showing up in one way in the economic arena, and it was showing up in some esoteric groups that I've only came to hear about later as a crisis point. So the container that was held up until that point somehow needed to go through change, which I view in the context of the narrating of the epochal story as a symptom rather than a cause. That we were coming through the intensification of what we describe as indigo and the beginning of the rise of violet, which we have talked about in other times. So with that, let me proceed to, this was the inquiry that came my way. What practical ways and means would you suggest for an individual taking up this journey, and or for a team or a pod that's taking up this journey? And also, what essential counsels or cautions would you offer, again, an individual, a pod, about this journey? So this really opened a vast exploration, and I will distill some of that for us here today. The first point was, hey, can we relax in the way we approach this? Can we relax into the discovery of the inner conclave? You don't need to change yourself. You don't need to think you ought to be somebody else. Actually, it's an invitation to integrate the part of you that you often leave out. So it is not about trying to get it right. It is really about discovering who we are becoming. And the reason for the emphasis on the get it right is because if you've lived in the world, you've received that persuasion. If not in the first day you met your parents, then in the first day you went to school. And time and again, you find yourself in circumstances, professional circumstances, social circumstances, where you needed to find what the rules were so you could get it right. So when we talk about this work, many people will find that there is a tremendous amount of self-hindering, because that critical voice here says you're not doing it right. You should do something else. So it's about relaxing that first, and it's secondarily about being experimental, being adventurous, as you work to liberate an increasing range. One way I describe Jeff, and we talked about it over the weekend quite extensively, is that one way to describe the journey into adulthood, especially when people come into their 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond, it's a narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing range. There are all these places I've attempted to go to in the past where I've been criticized, I've experienced a scar tissue here, I've fell on my face there, I haven't been successful. So I am shrinking and shrinking and shrinking the range of my piano. Instead of playing on the full 7 octaves of my keyboard, I'm playing on maybe 1 octave, maybe an octave and a half. There is the semi-happy octave and the frustrated, agitated octave, but what about the fuller range of the human experience? So these were really the early invitations. And then I said, well, you want to find the media and you want to find the format that will enable you to truly experiment. And that may change from person to person. And you want to make sure you do some work on your own, you experiment on your own, and some people will sit indoors and some people will find it easier to go on a walk because some of us are kinetic, and some people will do it with quiet voice, and some people will want to sing the different voices, and some people will involve musical instruments, and some people will want to play with something with their hands or paint or draw. So there is a free ranging dimension to it. And then the suggestion is do work with a small group of people who are interested to explore the same or in an adjacent way, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 people, maybe 6. Larger group than 7, if you meet for a couple of hours, it's difficult to always maintain. There is tremendous value for larger groups, but if you want to be metabolizing your inner conclave, a group of 3 or 4 or 5 would enable that very much. And then decide between you whether sometime you dedicate the entire space to one person, and sometime you interplay and you each bring variety of voices in the conclave. And the emphasis there was that 19 out of 20 people will struggle to make headways on their own because of personal inhibitions, because of feeling, oh, I'm stupid when I do this, or that's not the right way to do this, and also because we're living into times where people are because of the immense pressure from media, from all sources, we have become very dense and very condensed on the inside. What happens, we are discovering increasingly, when you are with others, like here, you are allowing me a greater space than I may have on my own. Not only that, you have a unique way of unlocking for me a latent voice in me that I may not always be able to access by myself. And that's the gift that we offer each other. In other words, we are the space makers and the midwives of each other growth and possibility. And when we embark on a work like that, being with others will amplify and will augment for you your own space. Let me pause here and see what this brings up for you.
Excellent. Well, the first point that stood out and resonated in this system was around getting it right. And I started to feel into whether there's a point or a threshold beyond which we can see and embrace that when we actually engage with this inner conclave, we can't get it wrong. Because all of the voices and parts are conspiring to elevate and awaken and heal and liberate. So the friction, the burnishing, the contrast, even tension and apparent conflict is all in service. So there is only getting it right. When I sense there's some conditions of openness and others, I'm sure that could be named. And then the second point is around the community aspect. So there's an inner community, there's an outer community. I think it was in 2011 when I sort of blurted out in a retreat context that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the inner and the outer. So to have both the inner voices, the inner beings, the community of self, and the community of embodied humans who are mutually reflecting, mutually catalyzing, is whole. And there's a wholeness empowerment that follows.
Which is why I love so much being in this space with you, because you always have the capacity to offer this fine attunement and calibration. Absolutely correct. We can only get it right, including when we feel that we're getting it wrong. That wrongness has its function and is part of the catalyst for our own development. So, and then it led to point number 4, which was the invitation to alternate and or to work concurrently the foreground and the background. So first, when you get introduced to this way of exploration, the conclave voices, the conclave actors are the foreground. Then, as you begin to develop ease and versatility, you let them recede to the background, and the theme, the inquiry, the issue that you want to bring before the conclave becomes the foreground. And then you get to alternate and play with these. So it was at that point that it became useful and important to begin to instantiate it. So the foreground work is when I say, okay, let me sense into the voice of care. Can I say what I want to say and be even more grounded and fully embodied in the quality of care? Let me say the same thing, bring the same impulse, same appreciation, this time more centered in the quality, the voice of strength. Is there a third way to say the same, bring the same message with a generosity voice? So that would be that sense. And then can I discover the way of an appreciative friend? Can I discover the way of a development coach? And as we seek to inhabit and liberate and unlock the domain of healing, the domain of art, the domain of leadership, the different teacher guides that we may choose to cultivate, can we do so in an embodied way? Can I feel how they live in different parts of my system? Physically, energetically, and in my space. They will use different gestures. They will use different expressions. They will configure different language. So that's all the initial foreground. But then there is the issue, the need, the theme, the inquiry that we may choose to bring before the conclave. And I'm about to go into the 3 octaves and demonstrate this. And yet again, I have an instinct to pause here and give you a chance to comment on that.
Again, I'm appreciating the systematic approach, and I was feeling into what it would mean, what it would look like to say the same, well, to deliver the same message from these different voices with these different qualities. There's great liberating value, liberating the human soul, the full keyboard of 7 octaves, and so this is a practice for gently expanding and unfolding our capacities, which I might just try out.
Again, the origin point of that, which in some way is, I did not weave in the origin story I just offered to the Inner Conclave, but is nevertheless an element in there, is that I discovered very early when I started working with groups and leading workshops, which is now 40 years, that whatever I was going to teach, whatever was going to be the subject of the work, whether I was exploring the domain of polarities and dualities this world is filled with, whether I was exploring the discovery of how the mind has 3 natures, whatever I was working in the early teachings that I used to do, there would always be the content and the work in the meeting and the workshop with a group, and there will always be a private interior assignment that I gave myself. Sometime I would work on being more exact with language, so I'm clearer in my delivery. Other times I'd work on my gestures and how I use my body in space. A third time it will be working on the quality of patience. A fourth time I'd cultivate deeper and deeper and deeper levels of listening. A fifth time I'd be listening more to my intuition and to my clairvoyant capacities. Another time I'd come and the focus would be to more fully embody encouragement. So in essence, I was initiating myself through a development protocol while I was teaching others. And what I discovered that, of course, most teachers, as we know, Jeff, we teach other people, so we will pay attention. We're first delivering the message to ourselves. And I wanted to make sure that I never became dependent on having the group to continue my own journey. So that was one way of anchoring the self-tasking, the self-initiation process by framing a specific focus. And I've discovered that the richness of this was that I was able to select at any point in time where I was guided. Anything that this brings up for you?
Yeah, maybe you saw some kind of enthusiasm rise in my face. I was inspired to add life into the Inner Conclave.
Yes.
And there are 2 instances when I've worked with life in this way, at least, that I can think of right now. One is, I made a deal with life that the really difficult experiences were best had in dream space. So, all kinds of things we might think of as negative, horrific, whatever they might be, I've experienced that way. And it's interesting because when I made a deal with life, sort of in the dance with life, life actually responded in accord. There have been a few instances like that. So bringing what seems to be outer, what seems to be big, the vastness of capital L, life, and having that be an inner voice and participant in this process.
Yes, beautiful. So let us play with this idea of bringing an issue by beginning to explore the 3 octaves of work in the Inner Conclave. And as we said, the 3 octaves, the process octaves, we begin with healing and releasing. And the second octave that we named was developing and cultivating. And obviously these are interpenetrating realms. It's simply for codification purpose useful to look at these and then to also name contemplating, communion making, connecting. You would probably use also the word sourcing, different words to describe the higher octave in terms of the human capacity to be a conduit for greater intelligence. So we began with just providing a sample, a simple sample, and a possible first step. We started with this idea of rewriting and releasing the ghost experience. And the possible first step suggested there is, can I actually acknowledge the struggle? Am I able to not be distanced from the point of pain? Many of us, we've lived through, including many people in the developmental space, we've developed many sophisticated ways to bypass pain and struggle. And sometimes the unlock is actually in being able to bring that voice and acknowledge that voice. And to offer us entry through the side door, as we worked into this over the weekend, what I asked was, I asked like I came at it from another angle, and I said, ask what stands in the way of activating and bringing to life the inner conclave. And another way to ask the same question is, what are some thoughts, what are emotions, feelings, experiences, each of which may cause contraction, may cause shrinkage, and therefore hold us back from the inner conclave, but potentially also hold the key to the inner conclave, and when we invite that voice inside, can offer us an unlock of opportunity. So I love these moments in a workshop because that's the point where I bring many voices in, and I always prime myself with examples that in a minute I'll bring on the slide. What was beautiful was how the collective intelligence, the communal, mutualized, many voices commenting from their experience just made this discovery a lot richer. So here is a sample, a small sample of what we surfaced. Reactiveness. So when I'm reacting, I contract and I don't have a space for other perspectives because I'm in the reactive mode. When I'm able to bring that voice and acknowledge it and give it space and look at that voice from other parts of myself, the subject becomes an object. And now it is encouraged, it is compassionately guided into the point of trigger, perhaps. So that would be an example. Obviously, conflict and whatever else is causing contraction. When we are in the conflict, maybe internally, but maybe with a person next to us, can we then, right there and then, make the space to enter the conclave? Not easy, but that's the practice to bring to intense moments and situations. That's an interesting one. We each, by being a human, we have had moments of embarrassment. Sometime embarrassment gets imprinted early in life when we've done something that the environment told us was out of place, was not right, was not accepted, not appreciated. And so when we skate anytime near this experience, it will cause that contraction. But could it also be, Jeff, that some of those spaces contain some of the material, some of the content that can unlock our creativity, our innovation, our capacity to expand in a meaningful way? Could it be that some of the contraction we brought to ourselves by embarrassment was a misunderstanding 45 years ago. And we never had the circumstance to dissolve, to release, to melt what got frosted back then. And then that's a big one, self-criticism and censorship. But see, the self-criticism and censorship will prevent me from entering the inner conclave. So, but rather than fighting it with force, can I actually bring this voice and give it a treatment inside the inner conclave? And in a similar way, the need to be right and a whole variety of fears. Let me pause here, just give you a chance to comment on those first 6.
Well, this is becoming a roadmap for the examined life. Remember, the unexamined life is not worth living. At least that's a judgment of the unexamined life. It is what it is, and yet, when we look at the difficult places, and of course, memories are coming for each of the categories that you mentioned. I'm seeing that the contraction is like a springboard, potentially. The contraction could get locked in if there are screws and mechanisms for preserving it. On the other hand, maybe this comes back to the openness and maybe the relaxation as well, which you mentioned very early on. This contraction is a temporary state, which then enables an expansion that was not otherwise available.
Indeed. And so then we brought an interesting element, which is shame. Shame is often seen to be as one of the most unproductive, unhelpful emotions. But there are different kind of shame. There is the shame that really is arresting and paralyzing. And yet there is the shame that is a nudge inside us to alert us that we are not 100% fully present to the congruency of our intention. That is a constructive, positive shame. It's the soul's way of letting us know that we are not exactly in the tune that we hope to be in. So even working through those dimensions, which is a shame that I want to disarm and release, which is a shame that I embrace because it's an inner guide. All that is a rich discovery content. Again, in the first octave of working in the inner conclave. And then anytime I may feel that I become rigid, that I become dogmatic, that I become righteous in any way, is there an opportunity there to expand beyond the limitation of that conviction? And both by expanding that and also discovering why do I use these dogmatic beliefs as almost in a defensive way. It is part of my defense, and we will see in a little bit that how that came forward in another demonstration we offered. So, and then stress and pressure and identity fixing, any point where I think I finally figured who I am and I become fixated, I've just arrested my next discovery about who I am becoming. So that too has space and opportunity in the inner conclave. And that's a big one. That's a big one, diminished self-worth. In the mid-90s, I didn't like how absorbed the American culture was with self-esteem and self-worth and self-value. And I then discovered that I failed to see the deeper significance of what was inside this work for me. That there was something in my upbringing in the kibbutz in Israel that held me back from reflecting on this space. So I needed to come back to bring that element into the inner conclave. So before I make a concluding comment on that part of the journey, anything else that comes up for you, lives for you, when you reflect on these different natures?
Just compassion for the human journey, and just how much challenging material we've faced and successfully metabolized, actually. And for all the material that remains, we have made great progress. I am looking forward to seeing octaves 2 and 3.
Well, just before we embark on octave 2 and 3, I then made this move to visually describe that each of these dimensions had an opportunity. They held an opportunity for us, held the key into the inner conclave. And I want to give you a current example. So I've not spoken about this on Portals, and that's part of why I'm choosing today and this moment to bring this example. So we are now into the beginning of the 11th week of the devastating war in Israel, which impacted me in a major way because I have family and friends in Israel, and for the first time in my adult life, I experienced real fear and anxiety about the state of Israel. And for about 2 or 3 weeks, as I was metabolizing enormous amount of shock and grief and pain and fear for all the suffering, I negotiated in my inner conclave whether I felt called to speak to that on Portals. It was even compounded with the feeling that Israel is not doing a very effective campaign in positioning its story. But I realized that I may have very strong personal feelings about it, and I have deep feelings for suffering on all sides of the struggle, those that are in the region and those outside the region. And I realized that I needed to negotiate in my inner conclave and come to clarity that Portal's mission was to skate to the edge of the human experience and try to decode what was the liminal know-how and appreciation and discovery about what is happening in the collective human experience, and that it was going to become unhelpful and not productive for me to try to voice any dimension or any side of the struggle, because it will be incongruent with the mission of the endeavor. And it took me several weeks to negotiate this in the inner conclave and not feel shame and not feel guilt and embrace the fact that I have more lives in me than I choose to bring to the Portals project. And I can attend to those other lives and be in conversations with other people in other places. So this was an example where I used the facility of this work to listen to the different voices in me and give them place and negotiate and find what is the first principle and what is the second principle, and how was I going to reconcile and make and determine a course of action, which I've just shared with you for the first time. So I'm going to pause here, give you a chance to comment to this. And we've been an hour into this, so I'm going to editorially, while we are recording, close this part, and we'll continue to the next part as a new part that we will separate into 2 episodes.
Thank you, Aviv. Thank you for going there, for opening up what may be certainly one of the most difficult struggles that the human family is facing, which has ancient historical roots and antecedents, and the story is so thick. I would never attempt to offer any kinds of solutions. I right now just am bearing witness from, obviously a safe distance, but I feel it in my heart. And what we're talking about now is giving me additional hope that the conflict in Israel, other conflicts around the world, of which there are many, are part of the process of metabolizing the material of collective shame and defensiveness, dogmatic beliefs, reactivity in many forms, including violent forms. I suppose I would say I have faith that there's an intelligence guiding the inner conclave and the outer inner conclave, as in humanity is in some sense an inner conclave for this superorganism that is Homo universalis, perhaps, in its collective expression. And I'm listening for how to be with the situation on multiple levels that are constructive.
Where this guides me, Jeff, is that I am thinking that I would like to metabolize this struggle in an adjacent way by developing series of conversations on portals about war. What is war? Why are we seeing that so many people are at war, almost in a never-ending way? And a core premise that I'm going to be bringing to this inquiry is obviously the quest for peace, and with it the premise, the inquiry that could it be that we first of all need to learn to find peace on the inside, in the inner conclave, and that the outer is an expression of the inner, and the inner is the expression of the outer. And so to the degree that we can, if we can do this work, we may be able to change a fractal of the whole. And when we change a fractal of the whole, could we be changing the whole in itself? So with that, let me conclude this part. And if you traveled with us through to this point, wait, because we're going to come in part 2 and travel into octave 2 and octave 3 and example those additional natures of work in the inner conclave. Thank you. Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.